I was a neuropsychiatrist for more than 15 years, and in that time, I came to believe that memory is both the most fragile and the most terrifying thing we possess. People think of it as a library, an archive of images and facts neatly cataloged in the brain, ready to be pulled from a shelf at will. That's a comforting illusion. In truth, memory is smoke. It shifts, it fades, it rewrites itself without warning, often without our permission. We forget the faces of people we once loved. We misplace entire months of our lives to grief or routine. We bend the past to protect ourselves from it. That is the way of things. Or so I thought. Until I met the patient who shattered all of it. The patient who remembered everything. And yet, the one night he could not recall nearly killed him, and has haunted me ever since. I remember the fluorescent hum of the emergency room the night I first saw him. It was a Tuesday, though in the ER days and nights blur together until time itself feels irrelevant. The air smelled of bleach and something metallic, faint but unmistakable, the smell of blood that had passed through too many hands and cloths to be cleaned away completely. The waiting room was restless, filled with the low murmur of families and the occasional sharp cry that cut through the monotony. I was not on call for trauma that evening. My specialty brought me into cases when the line between brain and mind was blurred, when neurology and psychiatry overlapped like two shadows on a wall. Most nights my work was quieter than the surgeons and the trauma teams, but it was no less consuming. And that night, I was about to meet the patient who would consume me entirely. The nurse who came to find me was pale, her clipboard hugged tight against her chest. "Doctor," she said, hesitating before speaking again, "you should see this one yourself." She didn't say why. She didn't have to. Years in an ER teach you that tone. It was the tone of someone who had seen something they couldn't quite name, the kind of thing that made even seasoned staff look for someone else to hand it to. The patient was seated on a gurney, upright, calm, and watching the room around him, with the kind of attentiveness most people lose after childhood. His eyes followed every movement, every gesture, as though he were recording it. When he turned to me, his expression was not fearful, not confused, just aware. That was the first thing that unsettled me. ER patients are many things: angry, frightened, dazed, but they are almost never that composed, especially not when their lives have just been in danger. I glanced at his chart as I approached. Male, 33 years old. No prior psychiatric history. Brought in after collapsing at home, though the initial workup had shown nothing abnormal. Vital signs, stable, no trauma, no intoxication, no immediate neurological deficits. He had been coherent from the moment that the paramedics arrived, but something in the notes caught my eye. Patient claims complete recall of life events. Requests neurological evaluation. When I sat beside him, I introduced myself the way I always did, with the reassurance that I wasn't there to judge or condemn, but to understand. He gave me his name. Let's call him Daniel, though that isn't the one he used, and he said it with a faint smile as if I already knew him. His voice was calm, steady, without the tremor of someone in distress. That calmness unsettled me more than a scream ever could. "Do you remember why you collapsed?" I asked. "Oui." He tilted his head, considering the question carefully, as though rehearsing the precise words before speaking. Then he said, "I remember everything. Every day. Every detail. I can tell you what you asked me 3 minutes ago. I can tell you what I ate for breakfast 11 years ago, on April 12th. His tone carried no boast, no delusion. Just fact. Patients exaggerate. Patients confabulate. But Daniel did not. There was something in his eyes that told me he was not lying. And for the first time in many years, I felt a chill at the edge of my professional certainty. If he was telling the truth, then sitting before me was a human being whose memory worked in a way the rest of us could not begin to imagine. And if he was lying, then his conviction was unlike any I had ever seen. That night, as the monitors blinked quietly beside us and the distant sound of a trauma alert echoed from the far wing of the ER, I realized this was not going to be a typical case. This was not stress-induced fainting or a mild seizure or a psychosomatic plea for attention. This was something else, something I did not yet understand, something that, if I let it, would pull me into a labyrinth from which I might never emerge. He leaned forward slightly, and for a moment I felt as if he were studying me, memorizing me, the way you might memorize the details of a photograph before it fades. "If you like," he said, "you can test me." It wasn't a challenge, not arrogance. It was an invitation, delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone you'd use to offer someone a glass of water. I obliged. It would have been irresponsible not to. I asked him what day of the week, July 8th, 1997, had fallen on. He didn't blink. "Tuesday," he said. It was humid. I was 12 years old. My mother had made grilled cheese sandwiches, and I remember the sound of the neighbor's dog barking just as I was biting into mine. The bread burned the roof of my mouth. The pain lasted until bedtime. I felt a current of disbelief run through me, the professional instinct to test harder. I asked him what tie I had worn to the hospital the previous Wednesday. He smiled faintly. "A navy-striped one. You spilled a little coffee on it before lunch." My mouth went dry. That was true. It had happened in the lounge, and no one had been there to see. Within minutes, I felt my skepticism eroding. I tried numbers, dates, fragments of conversation. Every answer was immediate, precise, and wrapped in sensory detail that felt too organic to have been invented. It was as though he were replaying a recording in his mind and simply narrating it back to me. There is a term, hyperthymesia, for individuals with extraordinary autobiographical memory. I had read of it in journals, studied case reports, but never seen it in person. Until that night, it had been a clinical curiosity to me, a phenomenon at the margins of neuroscience. Now it was flesh and blood, sitting calmly on a gurney under the sickly glow of ER lights. Still, something was wrong. He had not collapsed without cause. Even a perfect memory does not make you immune to the vulnerabilities of the body. I began to ask him about the day of his episode, retracing his steps, searching for a trigger. He recounted his morning in meticulous detail, the cereal he had eaten, the headline of the newspaper on his kitchen counter, the exact sequence of traffic lights he had passed on the way to work. He told me about the emails he had read, the sound of the pen clicking in the hand of a colleague during a meeting. He spoke without hesitation, his words a steady flow, each memory anchoring the next. But then he stopped. For the first time since we began, his brow furrowed. He inhaled slowly, as though the air itself had become difficult to process. "After that," he whispered, "I don't know." I leaned forward. "You don't know what?" He met my eyes, and in them I saw something colder than confusion. Fear. "I don't know what happened that night." The silence that followed seemed to expand, pressing against us. The monitors ticked. The hallway echoed with the clatter of a gurney rushing past. Somewhere a child cried in the waiting room, but between us there was only the void of something missing. "You remember everything," I said quietly. "Every day, every detail." "Yes," he answered, almost pleading. "Everything. Since I was a child. I can tell you the shirt my father wore when he taught me to ride a bike. I can tell you the exact words my teacher used the day she accused me of cheating. I can tell you the smell of the rain on the sidewalk on my 15th birthday. I never forget. Not a single day, not a single moment." His hands trembled as he clasped them in his lap. "Except that night. That night is gone." "What night?" "The night I collapsed." His voice cracked then, the calmness breaking like glass. I came home. I made dinner. I remember pouring the glass of water. And then, nothing. There is nothing. I woke up with the paramedics above me, asking if I could hear them. And I couldn't tell them where I'd been, because I didn't know. I still don't. There are kinds of amnesia that come with seizures, with head trauma, with intoxication. They carve holes in the mind's record, gaps that can sometimes be explained by damaged tissue or disrupted circuits. But this was different. This was a man whose entire life was an unbroken chain of memory, each link fused to the next. And one link, one solitary link, had been removed as though by an unseen hand. The hair at the back of my neck rose. I felt, for the first time in my career, as though I were standing at the edge of something I could not chart. Something medicine could not map. I ordered the standard tests. EEG, MRI, toxicology screens. I called in neurology, consulted psychiatry, reviewed his labs. Everything came back clean. His brain showed no lesion, no abnormal activity. His blood revealed no poison. His heart and lungs were steady. By every measurable standard, he was a healthy 33-year-old man, except for the fact that one night of his life had been obliterated from existence. When I returned to him, with the results, he looked up as though expecting me to hand back the missing memory, wrapped in clinical explanation. But all I could give him was the truth he already knew. "Daniel," I said slowly, "your tests are normal. There's no evidence of seizure, no sign of trauma, no chemical explanation." He laughed then, a hollow sound that carried no amusement. "So you're saying I'm fine?" "I'm saying your body is fine," I replied, "but the memory is gone," he finished for me, "and you can't tell me why." There was no anger in his tone, only resignation, only the helplessness of a man who had built his identity on the certainty of recall, only to discover that certainty had limits. That night, as he rested under the fluorescent shadows of the emergency room, I sat in the corridor outside his curtain and felt a weight pressing against my chest. I had faced patients who could not remember their own children, patients who had lived entire decades erased by dementia, patients who begged me to help them recall one precious fragment of the past. But I had never faced the inverse. I had never faced a man who remembered everything, and who was haunted, not by too little memory, but by too much. And somewhere deep within me, beneath the layers of training and reason, a question stirred. If memory is the thread of our identity, what does it mean when a single night is cut away? What could be so terrible, so unexplainable, that even a perfect mind cannot hold on to it? That question would grow in me, seed by seed, until it consumed more than my professional certainty. It would consume my sleep, would consume the way I thought of memory itself. And it all began with the night Daniel could not remember. I kept him for observation. That was standard protocol, but if I'm honest, I kept him because I couldn't let him go. Something in my gut told me that sending him home would be like walking away from a locked room you knew held a secret, too large to ignore. I told the nurses to monitor him closely, and I arranged for a battery of neuropsychological tests the next morning. If Daniel's mind really functioned the way he claimed, then we would see it reflected in performance. Working memory, long-term recall, associative tasks. But the problem wasn't proving what he could remember. The problem was the one thing he couldn't. The following day I met his sister, who had driven in after hearing of his collapse. She was a woman in her 40s, practical, with the kind of tired concern that told me she had long been her brother's protector. When she spoke of him, her words carried equal parts awe and exasperation. "He's always been like this," she told me in the hallway outside his room, "since he was a boy. He could recite whole conversations we'd had years earlier, down to the pauses and the way I'd rolled my eyes. It was uncanny. My parents didn't know what to make of it. They thought maybe he was just clever. But it was more than that. He never forgot anything. Not even the bad things. Especially not the bad things. Her eyes darkened as she said it, and I caught a glimpse of the burden Daniel must have carried. To remember everything is not just to preserve joy, it is also to trap pain in amber, unsoftened by time. A normal mind forgets to protect itself. Daniel's could not. "What do you make of this missing night?" I asked her. Her lips pressed tight. "That's just it," she said. "He called me the day before it happened. Perfectly normal. He told me what I was wearing, what I'd said the last time we'd argued. He always does that, like he's proving a point. And then, the next morning, I get a call that he'd collapsed. But when I asked him what happened, he just said he didn't know. He kept repeating it. He looked at me like a child who'd lost his parent in a crowd. He's never said, 'I don't know,' about anything before." I thanked her, though her words left me with more questions than answers. Inside the room, Daniel was awake and alert. He had consented to the tests, and the technicians were preparing him with electrodes, clipboards, and a series of tasks designed to measure the architecture of memory. I stayed for part of it, watching as he repeated back long strings of numbers without effort, recalled obscure words after only a single presentation, and described in granular detail a childhood trip to the beach with his family. He performed at levels far beyond any subject I had ever tested. He was, in every sense, the embodiment of perfect autobiographical recall, until we reached the night. When prompted to describe the evening before his collapse, he began confidently. The cereal at breakfast, the emails at work, the sound of his neighbor's lawnmower. But when the sequence reached dusk, his voice faltered. He stared at the wall, lips moving silently as though groping for something that should have been there. After a long pause, he whispered, "It's gone." We tried memory cues, words, images, sense, but nothing breached the void. That night for Daniel had ceased to exist. Later, after the session ended, I sat beside him, while the monitors continued their steady pulse. "Daniel," I asked carefully, "do you have any sense, any feeling at all, of what might have happened?" He turned his eyes toward me, and I felt the weight of a man who had carried the burden of perfect memory all his life, now facing a silence in his own mind. "When I close my eyes," he said slowly, "I feel something. Not an image, not a sound, just a weight, like the shape of something pressing against the glass. But I can't see it, and it frightens me, because if I can forget one night, what else could be taken from me?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. That evening, his sister brought in a box of old family photographs, hoping they might anchor him. They sat together on the bed as she held up pictures. Birthdays, vacations, Christmas mornings. For each, Daniel recited details. Who had been there, what they'd eaten, even the smell of pine needles from one particular winter. His precision was uncanny, almost mechanical in its exactness. But when she produced a photograph from the day before his collapse, a candid shot she had taken at lunch with him, his expression faltered. In the photo, Daniel was smiling, fork in hand, the plate before him, half empty. His sister remembered the meal well, down to the conversation about a book she had been reading. But when Daniel looked at the picture, he shook his head. "I know that's me," he said, "but I don't remember being there." The air in the room grew heavy. His sister's hand trembled as she lowered the photo. "But you were," she insisted. "I was with you." "I believe you," Daniel said quietly, "but it's not in me. It's like looking at a stranger's memory." That was the first time I saw tears in his eyes. The staff began to whisper. They didn't know the details, but they sensed the strangeness. Nurses spoke of how Daniel seemed too composed, too aware, as though his gaze peeled back the surface of everything he saw. One orderly told me, half joking, that he felt Daniel could recite his life story after a single glance, but none of them laughed when they said it. For me, the unease only deepened, because the more I tried to probe that missing night, the more impenetrable it became. And the more Daniel seemed to feel that the absence was not random, but deliberate. "Doctor," he said one night as the ward quieted, "what if something happened that I wasn't meant to carry?" I studied him carefully. "What do you mean?" He looked past me, his eyes unfocused. "I've never been allowed to forget. Not once. Every mistake, every shame, every pain. They're all still inside me, as raw as the day they happened. I've asked myself 1,000 times why. Why me? Why this memory? And now, suddenly, I forget one night. One night when I nearly died. Doesn't that feel intentional?" His words chilled me because they echoed a thought I had been unwilling to admit. Memory lapses from seizures or trauma usually leave behind at least fragments, sensations, flashes, something. But Daniel's absence was absolute, like a page torn clean from a book. I increased the scope of our investigation. We repeated scans. I requested sleep studies, cardiac monitoring, deeper neurological imaging. Every result came back pristine. His brain was healthy, his body was strong, and yet the void persisted. It was his sister who brought me the final piece that unsettled me most. She approached me in the corridor, her face pale. "Doctor," she said. I went back through his phone. I was looking for something, anything, from that night, and I found a voicemail. She pressed play. The recording was short, barely 10 seconds. It was Daniel's voice, left just after 11 p.m., the night of his collapse. His tone was panicked, breathless. "Something's wrong. I don't know what this is." The message ended abruptly in static. I felt my pulse quicken as the echo of his voice filled the sterile hallway. When I showed Daniel the recording, he shook his head, his face ashen. "I don't remember making that call," he whispered. "I don't remember anything." For the first time in years, I felt a fracture in the boundary between medicine and mystery. Something had happened that night, something violent enough to shatter the perfect machinery of a man's memory. And yet, it had left no trace we could measure. No scar on his body, no lesion on his brain, only silence where there should have been a record. And that silence was beginning to feel louder than any memory could. I listened to that voicemail a dozen times that night in my office, the glow of the computer screen casting pale light over the desk. Each replay felt like pressing my ear to a locked door. His voice, urgent, trembling. "Something's wrong. I don't know what this is." And then the static. Not the clean kind of silence you'd expect when a call drops. No, this was distortion. A sound like many voices whispering at once, layered over each other until the signal broke. I told myself it could be interference, a glitch. I told myself that, but deep down, it felt like something trying to drown him out. The next morning, Daniel looked worse. Not physically. His vitals remained stable. His tests continued to show no irregularities. But something in his demeanor had changed. The calm certainty he had carried when I first met him was eroding, replaced by a hollow watchfulness. His eyes darted as if he were waiting for something unseen to step into the room. He clutched his hands together as though to keep them still. "Did you listen?" he asked me when I entered. "Yes," I said honestly. "I did." "And?" I hesitated. "It's real. The call was real, but it doesn't tell us what happened." He closed his eyes, exhaling through his nose. "I knew it," he said. I knew there had to be something. You see, my memories, they're all complete. They come with sound, smell, taste, detail. I relive them, every single one. But when I try to reach for that night, there's nothing. Just pressure, like something standing between me and the memory. And now I know why. Something didn't want me to remember. I should have countered him, reassured him, reminded him that medicine doesn't bend for superstition. But I couldn't, because part of me, against every rule of science I'd sworn to, agreed with him. That afternoon, I convened a broader team: neurology, psychiatry, internal medicine. I laid out the facts. A man with hyperthymesia, flawless memory across decades, and one inexplicable void. They leaned on the familiar explanations. Perhaps a transient epileptic event. Perhaps dissociative amnesia triggered by hidden trauma. Perhaps a metabolic disturbance we hadn't caught. Each theory was sound, logical, and each fell apart under scrutiny. His EEG showed no seizure patterns. His scans revealed no lesions. His labs betrayed no imbalance. His life history offered no trauma that fit the timing. The head of neurology finally sighed and folded his arms. "Sometimes we have to accept what we can't explain," he said. "Document it. Observe. Move on." But I couldn't move on, because it wasn't just an unexplained symptom. It was the collapse of a system that had been flawless. Perfect memory doesn't fracture without cause. Something had broken him. Something had taken one night from him. The nurses grew more uneasy. One told me she heard Daniel speaking softly to himself in the dark hours before dawn. Not prayer, not self-comfort, but reciting. Phone numbers, addresses, long lists of facts, as though reminding himself they were still there. Another swore that when she checked his room, he startled and demanded to know the exact minute of her arrival, as if to anchor himself in the timeline. "It's like he's afraid the rest will go," she whispered to me. His sister visited daily. She tried to reassure him, but she too began to fray. One evening, as we stood by the vending machines, she confessed, "He keeps asking me about that night. Over and over. What did you see? What did I say? What did we talk about?" "I wasn't even there, doctor, but he looks at me like, if I don't answer, he'll fall apart." I stayed with him late that night. The ward had quieted. The fluorescent lights dimmed to a muted hum. He sat upright in bed, hands clasped around his knees like a child. I asked him what he felt in the void, not what he remembered, what he felt. He hesitated. His lips trembled. Then he whispered, "I feel watched." The words sent a chill through me. "By what?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "But when I close my eyes, it's like I'm standing on a stage in the dark, and there's an audience I can't see. I can't hear them. I just know they're there. And when I try to look at them, the memory shatters." I searched for words to reassure him, but none came. Because as he spoke, the hair on my arms rose, and for a moment I too felt that unseen audience pressing against the silence of the room. In the following days, his fear deepened. He began to refuse sleep, afraid that when he closed his eyes, more of his memory would be stolen. We tried sedatives, but even when his body slept, he woke gasping, saying he had dreamed of static. Not images, not voices, just a wall of noise rushing toward him. I revisited the voicemail, desperate for answers. I had a technician run it through filters, spectrograms, analysis. Beneath the distortion, there were fragments, shapes of sound that almost resembled words, but not in any language we could identify. The technician shook his head. "Could be artifacts," he muttered, though his expression betrayed doubt. I brought the results to Daniel, though part of me wished I hadn't. He listened once, then turned pale. "That's it," he said. "That's what I hear when I try to remember. That sound. That wall of static." By then, the staff avoided his room at night. They tended to him dutifully, but afterward they lingered in the hallway, whispering. A few even asked me outright if I believed him. I didn't answer, because the truth was, I didn't know what I believed anymore. Every possible explanation, every medical model I reached for, collapsed in my hands. Trauma, seizure, psychosis, interference. They all accounted for fragments, not the whole. None explained the voicemail. None explained the absolute void in a man whose mind had never before faltered. None explained the dread that now hung over the ward like a storm cloud. And each night I found myself replaying his words in my head. What if something happened that I wasn't meant to carry? For years, medicine had been my anchor. I knew the rules, the boundaries, the truths we could measure. But Daniel's case was beginning to dissolve that certainty. And as the days wore on, one question grew louder in my mind. What if forgetting was not failure, but protection? What if there are some memories we are never meant to keep? I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing with certainty. Daniel's missing night was not just a gap in recall. It was a wound, and the wound was spreading, not only in him, but in me and in everyone who stepped too close. Daniel stayed under my care for a week, long enough for the ER staff to grow used to his presence, and long enough for me to understand that his case would never resolve in the ways medicine demanded. Each day we repeated tests, looking for subtle anomalies. Each day we tried new angles, and each day the results came back maddeningly clean. By the seventh night, I found him sitting, upright in bed, staring at the wall. He turned to me when I entered, his eyes hollow, ringed with exhaustion. "Doctor," he said, "I've been thinking. What if this isn't about me? What if it's about you?" The words stopped me cold. "What do you mean?" "What if the reason I can't remember isn't because of my mind," he whispered, "but because someone else doesn't want me to tell you? What if it was never meant to be recorded? Not by anyone. Maybe I was allowed to carry everything else. But this isn't mine to hold. And that's why it was taken." That night was the last time I saw him. The next morning he discharged himself against medical advice. His sister pleaded with him, but he was resolute. "If nothing's wrong with my body, then no machine is going to give me back what I lost." He looked at me with an intensity that still burns in my memory. "If it comes back, doctor, I'll let you know. But if it doesn't, maybe it's better that way." And then he was gone. I never heard from him again. His sister left me a number, but when I tried it weeks later, it had been disconnected. I searched records, reached out to contacts, but there was nothing. No follow-up visits, no hospitalizations, no trace. He vanished from the system as if his life had folded in on itself. Yet his absence has never left me. In the years since, I've faced many patients, many tragedies, many mysteries, but none has hollowed me the way Daniel's case did. Because his missing night was not just about memory, it was about the limits of knowing. For a man who could recall every detail of every day, the absence was louder than any recollection. It was as though the universe itself had declared, "This you may not know." I've tried to rationalize it. Seizure activity, too subtle to catch. A microischemia leaving no trace. A psychiatric fissure opening in a man who had lived too long under the burden of recall. Each theory comforts me for a moment until I hear again the sound of his voice on that recording. Something's wrong. I don't know what this is. And the static. Always the static. Sometimes, late at night, when the hospital halls are quiet and the fluorescent lights buzz like distant wasps, I find myself listening to the hum and wondering if memory is less about storage and more about permission. We believe we own our lives because we remember them. But what if we remember only what we're allowed to? What if memory is not a library but a leash? I'll never know. What I do know is that Daniel changed me. He made me question not just the fallibility of memory, but the nature of it. And he left me with a silence that echoes louder than any story I've ever heard. The case will always, and yet I cannot let it go. Even now, years later, I find myself circling back to him in quiet moments. I see his face when I pass certain rooms. I hear his words when I wake in the early hours. I wonder whether he ever found peace, or whether he still wanders his own mind searching for that missing night. Perhaps he stopped searching. Perhaps he learned to live with the silence. Or perhaps the silence grew. I can only tell you what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. A man with a perfect memory, undone not by what he carried, but by what was taken. A single night, gone without trace. And the truth that unsettles me most is not that he forgot, but that maybe we all forget. That maybe our lives are riddled with silences we never notice, because we were never meant to. That thought follows me still, like static at the edge of every quiet room. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear it too.